Good afternoon, and welcome to this live event on reducing structural barriers to school and work for people with juvenile records. I'm Josh Weber, and I oversee the Juvenile Justice Program at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I'm pleased to be joined today by three distinguished panelists. Caitlin Dawkins is the Director of Justice Programs at FHI 360's National Institute for Work and Learning, where she leads the operation and strategy of projects that converge the worlds of education, workforce, and reentry. Bill Gill is the Director of Government Relations for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, where he manages and implements ACRO's public policy agenda and oversees federal government relations, legislative policy, and regulatory matters. And Andrew Morton is the Director of Certification and Veterans Affairs for the Society of Human Resource Management, where he informs and empowers employers and other organizations in their inclusion hiring efforts. To start this broadcast, I will provide a 20-minute overview of the key findings and recommendations from the recent study and report that we released, and then turn to our panelists for their reactions and discussion. We encourage you to join in today's discussion on social media using the hashtag #JusticeBriefingLive or in the comments box below the broadcast. If you're not familiar with the Council of State Governments Justice Center, we are a national nonprofit organization that works across all branches of state government as well as local government to improve outcomes for youth and adults in the justice system. First, to start, I'll provide a little bit of background on why we conducted this study and our methodology. So states have good reason to focus on reducing structural barriers to school and work for people with a juvenile record, and a number of reasons why we decided to conduct this study. First is that collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication affect a significant number of people. Despite national declines in juvenile arrests and juvenile referrals, over 300,000 young people are still adjudicated by the juvenile justice system every year. Over the last 5 years, that's over 1.5 million people. So that means collateral consequences of a juvenile record affect a significant proportion of the population in the United States. And that involvement in the juvenile justice system is disproportionate. 55% of all those who were adjudicated by the juvenile justice system are youth of color. As a result, any real focus on improving equity and outcomes for juvenile justice systems really should include a focus on trying to reduce collateral consequences and structural barriers to school and work. We also know that COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the economic and employment prospects of youth and young adults, and particularly youth and young adults of color. So currently, unemployment rates for Black youth and young adults sit at almost 16 to 17%, compared to 10 to 12% for white youth and young adults. And we also know from previous economic recessions that unemployment rates for youth and young adults tend to bounce back a lot slower than they do for other demographic groups. So it really is a critical moment in time for states to be trying to reduce as many barriers as possible to connecting these young people with continued education and workforce development. It's also generally a misnomer that people with juvenile records don't have collateral consequences, and also that sealing and expungement laws really address all of those consequences. In fact, as we'll get to in a minute, many people are not eligible for sealing and expungement, and research has showed even that those who are eligible often don't take advantage of that opportunity. Recent research has shown that less than 7% of people who are eligible for sealing and expungement actually get their records cleared within 5 years of eligibility. And so it's really important that state statute really from the start tries to impose as few consequences on individuals as possible. There are also some research-based reasons why a focus on collateral consequence reform is important. First, we know from a lot of research that educational obtainment and employment are associated with improved lifetime earnings and reduced crime. So really, there are significant benefits that accrue to both individuals as well as communities by trying to make sure that people with juvenile justice involvement can connect with education and employment opportunities. That's particularly important because we know that the deck is already stacked against people with criminal records. A lot of research has shown that employers are more reluctant to hire people who have been convicted of a crime. And that research includes that employers are biased against individuals whose only offenses include just juvenile adjudications. We also know from research that post-secondary applications, admissions applications that ask about criminal history have a deterrent effect. Attrition rates have been shown to be over 3 times higher in terms of completing applications for people with a record than their peers without a record. And those questions continue to be asked, even though there's no evidence that those questions actually have a positive impact on public safety. And finally, collateral consequences reform is equally important for both youth and adults who have been involved in the justice system. But recent research in brain science has made clear that youth and young adults are not mini adults, that they are developmentally wired to act impulsively, to not consider the long-term consequences of their actions, and to be heavily swayed by their peers. So it's an added consideration for states in terms of a focus on collateral consequences, on wanting to make sure that people are not potentially penalized for the rest of their lives due to mistakes that were only committed during their adolescence. A little bit about the methodology of the study that we conducted, which is really a first of its kind examination of comprehensive state statutory and administrative barriers that specifically affect people with juvenile adjudications. We focused in particular on education and employment related collateral consequences, and those collateral consequences that follow people after their involvement in the juvenile justice system. To conduct the study, we selected a representative sample of 12 states in terms of geographic and political and demographic diversity across the country. And for each of those states, we did a comprehensive statutory review. So not just reviewing juvenile justice statute, but criminal justice statute, education and employment statute, as well as occupational licensing statute. In every state, we also paired that statutory analysis with a review of every public university admissions application, as well as the largest private universities and community college admissions applications. And we also looked at employment applications for the largest public and private employers in every state. Finally, we also conducted national focus groups to assess people's understanding and perspectives on the collateral consequences of a juvenile record. Those focus groups include a diverse set of stakeholders, including juvenile justice agencies, judges, attorneys, employers, human resource professionals, admissions officers, and importantly, youth, young adults, and adults who have had lived experience with the juvenile justice system. So what did we find? Our first key finding is that every state that we looked at had state law that was designed to limit the collateral consequences and distinguish collateral consequences based on an adjudication compared to a criminal conviction. But that those provisions really may not achieve their intended purpose in practice for a number of reasons. First is when looking across juvenile and criminal justice and education and employment statute, language was inexact, it was ambiguous, and often unclear. Sometimes collateral consequences were triggered by an adjudication, sometimes a conviction, sometimes a finding of guilt, sometimes a criminal record. And so this ambiguity and inconsistency really makes it difficult for those both applying the law, as well as those with juvenile records that are affected by these laws, to really understand where and how collateral consequences impact them and what the consequences of those provisions are. Second is every state had some explicit exceptions and did in fact impose collateral consequences explicitly as a result of a juvenile adjudication. In some states that was for anyone with a juvenile record, in other states it was for only people who commit more serious or repeated offenses. But common restrictions in many states include individuals with a juvenile record being ineligible for any kind of law enforcement or public safety professions, being ineligible for healthcare professions, or any kind of youth and family service professions. We also saw restrictions in terms of financial aid. And so it could be that a young person who was an honors student and got into a school fight, one-time school fight, and was adjudicated as a result of that school fight, could find themselves permanently ineligible for state-based financial aid, including merit-based aid. Pretty much every state we looked at also had broad moral character provisions, which is essentially give licensing boards very broad discretion to restrict people from earning a wide variety of occupational licenses because of their quote unquote moral character. And in the vast majority of states, those moral character assessments were not restricted from including juvenile adjudications. So again, a young person who committed a minor offense could find themselves ineligible for certain career pathways for the rest of their lives because of these broad moral character provisions, or just maybe uncertain about whether they are eligible, and that could prevent them from even considering certain career pathways. And then finally, states varied in terms of their record confidentiality laws. While juvenile records are generally confidential in most of the states we looked at, most of the states also had confidentiality exceptions for youth who committed more serious or repeated offenses, as well as in some states, some limited information on those juvenile records were made available to the public. And so a state could have really minimal collateral consequences laws. They could have the best sealing and expungement laws in the country, but exceptions and loopholes in their confidentiality laws could really undermine all of those other provisions. Our second key finding was that the majority of both public and private post-secondary institutions and some employers in the studied states asked applicants about their criminal history and or required background checks. So in terms of post-secondary applications, in most states, applicants to public as well as private four-year post-secondary institutions, as well as applicants to some community colleges, have to still answer questions about their criminal history and even their school discipline history going back to the 9th grade. Importantly, those questions have to be answered with no opportunity for the applicant to distinguish between juvenile versus adult offenses, to distinguish the nature or the seriousness of their offenses, nor applicants having any knowledge about how the information would be used and whether it's disqualifying. So again, a young person who committed a minor offense such as trespassing or low-level marijuana possession would have to answer questions about their criminal history in the exact same way that someone would who committed a serious adult felony offense. Most of the studied states that we looked at had passed legislation for employers around ban the box. And so most of the employers and employment applications, applicants didn't need to answer questions about their criminal history. But for many of those employers, their applications explicitly stated that applicants would have to pass a background check. And again, there was very little context about that background check, about whether juvenile adjudications would be considered the same way as adult offenses, and no knowledge of how that information revealed by a background check would be used. And so in our focus groups with people with lived experience, they shared that knowing they had to pass a background check and unsuring what the results would be was just as much a disincentive for them to move forward with an application as explicit questions about their criminal history. Our third major finding is that most states have some form of sealing and or expungement laws, but there are a significant number of issues that really limit the effectiveness of those laws. First is exceptions, which is many people are ineligible for sealing expungement. In some cases, that includes people who committed more serious delinquent offenses, but in some cases that includes any person who has more than one delinquency adjudication. And so you could have a trespassing offense and a breach of peace or minor disorderly conduct offense. And because someone had two offenses adjudicated, no matter how minor, they might find themselves ineligible for the rest of their lives for any kind of record clearance process. Second is that in a number of states, some record clearance processes were automatic, but in many of the states, that's not the case. And so the burden really falls on the affected individual to petition the court for record clearance. Oftentimes they would have to wait years to do so. And so in that really vulnerable time where young people are transitioning to young adulthood and are particularly looking to continue their education or connect to employment, their records may be still held against them. And then the record clearance process in many states costs hundreds of dollars in fees and requires people to wade through a burdensome and often complex set of administrative processes. And then after going through all of that work, in places where this decision is discretionary, very few states had any kind of really specific or guiding criteria for courts about actually how to make these kinds of critical sealing and expungement decisions. Perhaps more fundamentally, people often don't know about the collateral consequences before they admit or plea as part of their court case. Plea deals are very common in juvenile cases, and none of the states that we looked at had any sort of formal requirements that people were made aware of those collateral consequences. And most of the states had very few, if any, laws making sure that people were actually aware of record clearance, eligibility, or processes. And as a result, affected individuals were constantly unsure about what information they need to report, and that hampered their decisions about their educational and employment opportunities. So based on these findings, what are our recommendations to address these gaps and challenges in state law and state practice? The first is really an overarching recommendation around establishing a more comprehensive state law that would cross juvenile justice statute, criminal justice, education, employment, and occupational licensing that really prohibits any sort of inquiry into and consideration of juvenile adjudications in making education and employment decisions. So a couple of dimensions of that. First is to eliminate licensing and making occupational decisions due to juvenile adjudications. That really, state law should restrict that any consideration of juvenile adjudications be part of moral character provisions so that people with juvenile records have clarity and confidence that they can pursue career pathways without their juvenile adjudications being held against them in a very kind of discretionary way. Second is really to eliminate any kinds of financial aid restrictions for post-secondary education. Again, if we know that connecting people with past justice involvement with education, with employment has public safety benefits, has economic benefits, then it really doesn't make a ton of sense to restrict people from taking part in education as a result of their past juvenile justice involvement. Also recommend that all post-secondary institutions, both public, private, as well as 2-year and 4-year institutions, as well as employers, eliminate any questions related to criminal history. So that includes both juvenile and criminal records. If there is pushback around that, then at a minimum, post-secondary institutions should distinguish between juvenile adjudications and adult convictions, or at least provide an opportunity for context around the seriousness of the offense, and also to provide limitations on conducting background checks. And that background check should only be allowable when there's a really specific public safety rationale for the particular job at hand. The second recommendation is to really tighten up confidentiality laws. And so a lack of confidentiality doesn't become a loophole and allow employers, education institutions, and others to really get access to records in a way that undermine other kinds of state statutes. First is restricting access broadly, not just to court records, but to juvenile arrest records and other records, certainly to the public at large, and that records should be limited by employers for licensing, admissions, and other kinds of similar purposes. And that really almost all automatic exceptions to confidentiality law should be limited. The burden of proof should really be on the state to prove that a record should not be confidential, whether that's for certain serious offenses or repeated offenses, but rather than making some automatic exceptions, having there need to be proof that the record does need to be shared because of specific public safety reasons. And also ensuring that juvenile records are not reported, except potentially in the most serious cases, to the Federal Bureau of Investigations. So in many states, the most common form of a background check is going to identify records that were reported to the FBI. And states can voluntarily choose to report or not report juvenile adjudications to the FBI, and they can choose what types of cases and cases not to report. So if states make the statutory and policy decision to not report most, if not all, cases to the FBI, then in many cases, juvenile records and juvenile adjudications won't show up on a standard background check. The third recommendation is really trying to make sealing and expungement processes more accessible to really try to increase the number of people who are both eligible and who take advantage of these. And that includes making them automatic wherever possible, and they should be at no cost to the individual affected, and really as soon as possible after their involvement in the juvenile justice system ends and they reach the age of majority. And as many people should be eligible as possible. So just committing repeat minor offenses should not make people ineligible for this kind of automatic no-cost sealing and expungement. If exceptions are necessary from the state for more serious and violent offenses, states should still require automatically scheduled sealing and expungement hearings. Again, the burden should not be on the affected individual to have to figure out their eligibility, to have to proactively petition the court, to sometimes incur legal expenses and figure out all the rules and regulations. Really, states should automatically schedule those hearings within an appropriate amount of time. And there should be clearly defined criteria, whether that's related to rehabilitation or that individuals have repaired the harm caused to victims and communities, but more standardization for judges on how to make these critically important decisions. The fourth recommendation is to ensure that people in the juvenile justice system are informed about potential collateral consequences as they're going through the adjudicatory process, as well as their future rights and obligations. So first is that state law should require and also provide the necessary resources and supports to juvenile courts and or defense attorneys to make youth and their families aware of potential collateral consequences before they agree to a plea deal. Before agreeing to that plea deal, knowing that there could be education and employment lifelong ramifications as a result of that plea deal really is critical to make sure youth and families have a full awareness of the decisions that they're making. It's also really important that whether it's state courts or local courts, but there should be some clear written guidance that actually summarizes the collateral consequences that follow people after case closure, so that they understand what information they do and do not need to report, so they understand what sort of employment, occupational, and educational pathways might be curtailed or that are available to them. And people should have really clear information for knowing whether they're eligible for sealing and expungement and what that process entails. Similarly, upon successful record clearance, affected individuals should receive clear written notification about what they need to disclose and what they don't need to disclose in terms of their rights and obligations in the future, so that they can really move forward with pursuing their education and employment goals, knowing that they don't have to be hindered by their records for the rest of their lives. Finally, we think it's just important to place this report and this study in a broader context, which is a real focus on improving education and employment outcomes, and more broadly, economic mobility and equity for people with juvenile records and that have been impacted by the juvenile justice system. As you can see, we've produced a number of reports related to education and employment for youth in the juvenile justice system, and many states have a long way to go to really ensure that that's an important part of juvenile justice policy and practice. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to our panelists and really start with a first question to get your reactions to these study findings and recommendations. In particular, whether there was anything that you found especially surprising or enlightening or compelling. And Caitlin, let's start with you.
Great, thank you, Josh. And yeah, I had a lot of reactions when reading this report initially. And I really think that my first reaction to the study findings was that it really aligned with what we hear on the ground through our FHI 360 reentry programs from the youth about their personal experiences in the juvenile justice systems as they are working to transition into post-secondary education, training programs, and the workforce. And overall, how there's just this kind of greater need and support around allowing youth to make the most of their second chance. And I believe something outlined well in the report that may come as a surprise for most or some is the ambiguity in the law and how we expect everyone, but specifically youth, to navigate it. And it really is overwhelming. While we have this kind of great news that most states' juvenile justice codes state that juvenile adjudications are not considered criminal convictions for the most part, there is still that gray area that you talked about, Josh, and unclear language in the law about the extent to which juvenile adjudications may be considered as a basis for imposing these kind of legal barriers to education and employment. And speaking to youth about their personal experiences in the juvenile justice system, we hear different ways in which youth are impacted by their juvenile records. Some youth can confidently kind of build these skills to get a job, but then they face the job application with this dreaded question. And it's about criminal history. It can say convicted, it may say adjudicated delinquent. And for a young person to even be able to kind of navigate what that means, legal jargon, and how that really leaves our youth feeling conflicted about revealing juvenile adjudications up front to try to be honest, or taking the risk of their employer finding out later. And it really can make them feel hopeless because their two options really feel like, number one, risk not getting hired up front. And the second option is getting fired later for not being honest, or kind of that moral responsibility. And neither one of those are great options. And so I think kind of the overall question that this report really raised for me was, how do we expect young people to navigate the law? What is morally responsibility, self-advocacy, and protecting their confidentiality, all when the language is so vague and unclear. And so I really like the recommendations in this report around the overarching policies and recommendations for presumptive confidentiality outlined in the report, to make all juvenile records confidential, and the universal free of charge, which I want to kind of highlight that free of charge part, and record clearance of every youth involved in the juvenile justice system. I really think that is a way forward, and that will get youth, employers, and education systems all on the same page about how juvenile records can, or better yet, cannot be used to exclude youth from opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Bill, what stood out for you?
First, Josh and the Council of State Governments, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today with everyone. A little bit about, again, I work with the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. We're in a higher education association. It's been around since 1910, 11,000 members. And so kind of our members are kind of in the nitty gritty of this, right? We have the records and retention aspect of what we do with the registrar's office. And then we have the other front end, which is, the admissions office and the process. So they're the ones that are reading the applications of all these folks. And what really stood out to me, Josh, was some of the very similar perspectives that we have in correlation to this report. The most important aspect for us is kind of what the chilling effect that it has on a prospective applicant who's considering to apply to college. They see that and they immediately just freeze up, and it's a barrier instead of a data point that is really kind of being utilized for anything else than basically for federal reporting requirements, which is not even required. So for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, kind of led ACRO to develop a work group comprised of our members to study the whole issue of criminal and disciplinary history and admissions process. And within that work group, we had not just members of ACRO, but we also had folks from NACAC, which is the high school counselors. We had the Association of University Lawyers. We had some representation from the Common App, which some folks may or may not know. That's a universal application that many high school students utilize to apply to multiple colleges instead of just every single college. And so it was a wide community-based effort, and I'll talk a little bit about what our recommendations, which kind of go hand in hand with your recommendations, Josh.
Andrew, anything in particular that stood out to you about the study and the findings?
Well, first of all, like everyone else said, Josh, incredible, impactful report that you all put together. I mean, the evidentiary nature of it itself is quite sobering, because in reality, what we're really talking about here, and I think one of the things that really strikes me is what we're seeing across the board in terms of the adult workforce population as well, and that is how disproportionate this affects marginalized populations, and how disproportionately it affects inclusive and diverse workplaces. And the ultimate challenge in that is it's not to have anything to do with workforce readiness. It has everything to do with a system that may create artificial barriers, as opposed to, no one's asking anybody to lower the bar of employment. What we're asking organizations to do, SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, is to ultimately, responsibly, and resourcefully hire, whether it's young men and women or whether it's members of the adult population. Because we know this. We know that there were, as of a year and a half ago, 7 million jobs in the job market openings with 6.3 million applicants. So we're already dealing with a deficit to begin with. And I think beyond the moral imperatives of the way that organizations and the way that human resources manages young men and women who may have been through adjudication or who may have criminal backgrounds, beyond the moral and ethical imperatives, it's a business imperative, really, to bring these young men and women into the workforce. Now, of course, the longer that they're out of the workforce, we also know this: the number one predicator of recidivism, whether it's juvenile or adult, is joblessness. So this is not just about the moral and ethical imperatives to repair the justice system and to get young men and women opportunities. It's also about the business imperative of really organizations. And that's how we lead with it. Typically, I speak to organizations about adult populations, re-entry, and getting talent back to work is the 2-year commitment that we've been doing that's gotten so many thousands of HR professionals educated and resourced into doing this. But the reality is this isn't getting talent back to work. This is getting talent to work. This is giving people first opportunities, and frankly, opportunities that are not only well-deserved, but much needed in today's work market.
Thank you, Andrew. Caitlin, you spoke to this a little bit, and Andrew's comments certainly get at this, but sometimes when we do these kinds of broad policy analyses and we talk about state laws, it's easy to forget about the reality of the actually impacted individuals, not just youth and young adults, but potentially adults for their entire lives that have a juvenile record and have to struggle with how to deal with that. Can you talk a little bit about, you're close to folks on the ground, you're close to the workforce development programs that are trying to help these populations, what you hear from them about how the state laws actually impact their day-to-day experiences?
Yes, I'd love to. And FHI 360's National Institute for Work and Learning, we run a variety of programs, and we really build in an equity lens for all of our programs. And in particular, our workforce reentry projects that are what make up our Compass Rose Collaborative. We specifically work with, young people ages 18 to 24, and we do this collaborative across states, across multiple states, 9 states, so that we can share practices as well as lessons learned. And being really having the ability to really talk to young people who are impacted and really kind of be on the ground. It just really kind of brings all these issues to the surface, Josh. And I think about just collateral consequences in general. I mean, it's so challenging because, first of all, there are so many, right? There's 40,000, over 40,000. So, of course, there's a challenge with that in itself. And also just thinking about how, since many of them are so non-related to ability or suitability for the actual job itself, it really limits certifications and credentialing that our participants can receive and fields that they can enter for viable employment opportunities. I also think that some of the challenges of just the variance of these collateral consequences across the states is a barrier to programs like ours that operate across multiple states. Because the Compass Rose Collaborative does that, we really have to intentionally stay up to date on collateral consequences and know that just because a credential and certification in one state may be really good for people impacted by the justice system, there may be barriers or ineligibility in another state. And so really trying to share those promising practices as a community of practice across states, it really raises some challenges. And we also know that there's also constant changes in the labor market as it is. It's recently been heightened by the pandemic, but we really have to work and be intentional in ensuring that everyone has access to these kind of emerging jobs as well. So while we're kind of already have these barriers of fields for collateral consequences, we're also thinking about emerging fields and making sure that our young people in our programs have access to those as well. So there's lots of challenges to juggle, and really working with employers, bringing on employer partners, and really monitoring the labor market are some ways that we really try to making sure that as many of our young people are included in these opportunities as possible.
Thanks for that, Caitlin. I guess I also want to uplift something you alluded to before, but that really struck us during the focus groups, which is how people can look at a law and say, oh, well, maybe that's not written as clearly as possible, and not think that that has specific and concrete implications. But focus group participants really sharing that because they weren't sure what collateral consequences applied, because they weren't sure what record clearance meant or didn't meant in terms of what they had to report, that sometimes that meant that, as I think you said this, that either they reported everything and maybe that oversharing might hurt their chances at education or employment, or they just said this is too complicated to figure out. And so when we talk about collateral consequences, it's not just the research that says people stop applications or people don't get hired as frequently, but what we don't see is where people's opportunities and decisions are precluded from the beginning, where people stop pursuing their goals and their dreams because they don't think they're even eligible. And that's kind of the hidden numbers and hidden toll that we don't really see.
And if I could just add into there, you absolutely hit the nail on the head, because if we're just talking about compliance versus culture, Title VII is somewhat ambiguous with regard to employers, and HR practitioners by nature, they're compliance focused. I mean, what the studies that we show indicate that hiring managers and executives are more willing to leverage the opportunities to hire those with criminal backgrounds than maybe HR practitioners. And that's not to say that HR practitioners don't want to, they just get compliance focused. So what we need to do is we need to also focus on culture, and we need to create an environment where there isn't a blanket policy, or maybe the background screening isn't on the front end of the application process. It doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be applied in an individualistic way later in the employment process. And that's twofold. One, it allows candidates who might not otherwise apply to have the freedom to apply in the first place. Because as Caitlin, you alluded to, many just won't even ever complete the application. We all talk about the black hole that applications go into sometime in the overall talent application process. You fill out an application and you never hear anything back. Well, double or triple that for the applications that never actually even are completed by a young man or woman because they feel like they're precluded from the market in the first place. So we need to get beyond compliance, and we need to create a culture where organizations are willing to take an individualistic approach to this.
And Andrew, if I may just add on real quickly, I mean, I love lawyers and all that, but unfortunately, many of these applications are written by lawyers, and as Caitlin mentioned, the language and is so confusing. And we've admitted also is that there's got to be clearer language, and if they're going to use legal terms, spell out what these legal terms are. Difficulty understanding that, and that's part of what we're trying to do for higher ed. If you're going to, explain to these applicants, to these students, the different, because some of these students they'll put in, I got busted for marijuana. Well, higher education institutions, they don't really care about that. They're more interested in, the more, the larger, and so, or underage drinking or anything like that. So those are the clarity around the language in the application process needs to be easy for individuals to understand.
I agree. Yeah, I wanted to make a quick comment about you brought up culture, Andrew, which is so important. And just really thinking about the approach from a human-centered perspective. Our young people are oftentimes trying to leave their past behind, and every time they go to fill out an application or sit in front of an employer, they're having to relive what probably may be the worst moment or the worst thing that they've ever done in their life. And so it does bring a sense of hopelessness to a lot of our young people. There are these myths, and they talk to each other about what they can do, what credentials they can do, what licenses they can do. So there is some misinformation as well as they're trying to navigate as young people all of these laws. And like you said, stuff written by attorneys, Bill. And I think that just really thinking about the human approach to this and how it makes our young people feel and how we can shift a culture so that our young people don't have to feel like they have to hide anything or that they'll be fired later, right? Like, we should have more employers welcoming of people in need of a second chance or young people that have made mistakes. And so fostering that culture of acceptance, I think, is really critical.
Yeah. One of the reasons why we conducted this study is obviously, we, as I mentioned, we think collateral consequences reform is important for people with juvenile and adult records. But to the extent that there is some resistance, our hope was, by focusing on those with the juvenile records, everyone understands that adolescents make mistakes. Everyone who's been an adolescent or parent an adolescent should have that understanding that we wouldn't necessarily want to penalize people in terms of their education and employment prospects for the rest of their lives because of a mistake in adolescence. But Bill, can you talk a little bit about where you see the pushback coming from and what strategies are needed with the post-secondary community? You mentioned the Common Application, and I think it was 2 or 3 years ago where the Common Application made the decision to actually remove the question about criminal history. But we found in our study that many, if not most, private universities and many public ones kept that question on. And so there's clearly still some resistance around this issue, whether it's juvenile records or adult records. Can you talk a little bit about where the pushback comes from and what you think is needed to address it?
I think we all we need to do is just a little more education, have more forums like this so people. The question we started looking into this issue goes back to around 1990 when legislation was passed, which is called the Clery Act, which requires institutions of higher education to report on an annual basis to the Department of Education what criminal activity has transpired on campus. So the thought process way back then was, well, we're going to minimize the criminal activity on campuses by asking this and then using that as a weeding, not let quote unquote bad students onto our college campus. That's the theory. the reality is that that theory has been looked at over the years, is that there is no correlation between somebody that has some criminal activity in their youth and how that's going to carry over to the higher education system. None. And so we're slowly going about this, and we're starting to see less, especially public institutions there's fewer. So a couple of years ago, we did a survey and 80% of institutions asked this question. Now we just recently did one a couple of years ago, and then it's down to 70%. There is legislation that have been passed in the states of Washington, Louisiana, Maryland, and Washington State, which bans this question on the college application. The CUNY system and the SUNY system, the Ohio State University, the UC system does not ask this question in the application process. So, as you mentioned, the Common App, that was a hard-coded question. So that was a hard-coded question and then a couple of years ago, they took off to be an optional question. That institution has to go back into the question and include it in there. What we're saying is that more public universities are more open to not including that question versus private institutions who are more apt to leave in there. I think if somebody would ask me, I think it's for campus perception and alumni. Just because of, we ask this question so we feel safer about the campus. I think it's just the perception, and it's having more of these conversations to be able to educate. I mentioned real quickly, we're running to, but so in our work group report that came out in December 2019, we specifically state that institutions should not ask a criminal history anywhere on the application process. And if an institution feels that they need to ask that, not be in the admissions process. If you're going to ask for, dorm safety or that kind of stuff, ask it after the individual has been offered the opportunity to attend an institution of higher education. We want to minimize the chilling effect. And in some instances, nowadays, what we found out with COVID, people, the online community of higher education has been booming over the last decade. So why would you why is that relevant if you're not even going to be stepping onto campus? So the only good news is that we're starting to see the pendulum swung to one extreme, and now we're starting to see the pendulum starting to get lower and lower in regards to people asking that question in the admissions.
Andrew, it sounds like you've had some pretty good success, but where you've had pushback, where has the pushback been? And in places where there is pushback, do you think getting people to maybe at least start thinking differently about juvenile records compared to adult records could be an effective strategy?
Well, I absolutely do. And I would say the pushback, to be quite frank and transparent, initially has come from the human resources profession itself. And again, it's not rooted in anything malicious. It's just rooted in compliance, and it's rooted in risk assessment and risk analysis. So what we really have to do is we really have to refocus ourselves on, again, building the business case as well as building the evidence. Bill, as you alluded to, you talk about that statistic, almost no correlation, if not an inverse correlation between a previous criminal background as a youth and performance in college. I mean, I would bet, I'd take it to the nth degree. I would bet that the young men and women who have the opportunity to go to college after having adjudication or criminal background as a youth are probably going to outpace the other college students, because what we've seen in the workforce is 82% of managers, people managers, say that those individuals working with them that have a criminal background outpace their performance of all the employees in general. I mean, so I guess what we have to do really, Josh, is we have to continue to build the business case around evidence. Now, that's difficult to do if the barriers are so high that we don't have enough anecdotal evidence to provide to people to demonstrate that their risk assessment is rooted in some sort of misperception. But we have to take these statistics, we have to take reports like yours, and we have to push these through the universities, because here's the thing. 78 to 87 billion dollars of gross national product is squandered every year because a lot of organizations do not consider hiring those people who have criminal backgrounds. That's a very sobering business statistic. And one out of every three Americans has a criminal background. So, I'm not going to call out anybody of the 300 plus people who are on the call today, but about 100 people who are on the call today may have a criminal background. So the point of which is to say is we have to relook at the evidence. We have to demonstrate that the evidence is there, and we have to create a culture around inclusivity that's not precluded by some sort of arbitrary barrier.
Caitlin, in some, if not many, juvenile justice systems, these issues are often off their radar. Understandable, often focusing on court conditions and compliance and recidivism reduction services. But COVID-19 and its economic impact on youth, young adults, communities of color has in many ways created unique challenges, unique opportunities, maybe a unique moment in time for juvenile justice systems to be partnering with other constituencies and have a greater focus on education, employment, and collateral consequence reform. Complicated question, hard to predict the future, but what do you see as potentially unique barriers, but maybe also some unique opportunities?
Yeah, I think, the nation really has some deep, economic scars from the pandemic that's going to take a long time to heal. I think there are many opportunities to take some lessons learned from the past year and to continue to help reduce barriers for people with records and really get, like you said, juvenile justice agencies involved in that practice. And I think the first thing we need to do is just collectively acknowledge how great the economy can be when people are employed, right? For economic development, we do not need people unemployed. So intentionally raising barriers to occupational licensing and work for people just isn't logical. And when the labor market is strong, the economy is boosted. In the recovery of the nation from kind of these wounds from the pandemic, we must ensure that people from that are impacted by the justice system are not left out. I think this is an opportunity for juvenile justice agencies to get involved, because while the focus for many is kind of those court order stipulations, the law, kind of those really particular things that a young person should be doing when they're in the juvenile justice system, not ignoring the impact of those pro-social activities. And Josh, you mentioned earlier in your presentation how kind of work and education and all of these pro-social things can be linked to lifetime earnings and reduced crime. And reduced crime should be like the number one thing juvenile justice agencies should be thinking about, reducing recidivism, keeping young people from going back to behaviors that got them involved with the justice system to begin with. And so I think there's a lot of emergent things. We have a lot of things coming down from the government about relief packages, training programs, rebuilding of our physical infrastructure. And I think that as we're thinking about all of these areas, whether it's public transportation, clean energy, we got to ensure that our young people that have records can access these new industries and have an opportunity, and that there's no barriers or stringent background checks to screen them out. I also think there's opportunities. We know a lot of our young people go into entrepreneurship to avoid the stigma of a background. And so making sure there's those resources for small business training, financial empowerment, all of these things. I think there's so many opportunities for juvenile justice organizations to start thinking about the youth development and actual pro-social part of probation, supervision, all of these contacts with our young people, and it really helps fold that into the work and learning aspect, and that they can really be some of the biggest advocates for some of these changes.
Hey, I think Caitlin, you may.
If I could just drill,
sure,
I want to put some real numbers behind that. Education determines how much money you're going to make over a lifetime. It's plain and simple. Somebody with a high school degree is most likely going to earn about 1.2 million throughout their lifetime. Just an associate's degree, an individual's going to earn 1.7 million. So $500,000 more. A bachelor's degree is going to be 2.1 million. So almost $1 million more. Why do I say this? Because of the COVID situation, higher education enrollment has gone down by 2.5%. People may say that's 2.5. That's not a lot, but it's 400,000 students that we are fewer enrolled in higher education. Community colleges were specifically more impacted. Enrollment is down nearly 14%. Public four-year institutions are down 4%. And a lot of those community colleges are where first-time generation communities of color are enrolled and get their first taste of higher education. And so at a time when we need to increase education attainment and increase individual wealth, we need to look for ways, we need to take down the barrier that would allow somebody to make a better life for themselves. This is the most powerful country in the world, yet only 37% of individuals have a bachelor's degree. Can you imagine what we could achieve if we had more people with advanced degrees?
Andrew, likewise, imagine there's a lot of employers and industries that have contracted and maybe experiencing slow growth, but also potentially significant opportunities for growth. And as you mentioned, applicants versus job gaps. Do you see kind of a unique moment in time here to be making some changes and increasing the workforce?
I think as a product of necessity, the 16 to 24-year-old job market it expands from about 4.4 million throughout the course of the year to about 17.5 million around the summer hire period between April and August. What we're seeing this year, early indications, maybe not last summer based upon the pandemic, we're seeing individuals hiring, and we're seeing them hire young Americans. And many of these young Americans, they're hiring out of necessity, regardless of their background. So the more we can invest in hiring practices that are, again, rooted on who's the best person for the job versus what adjudication they may have had in their past is going to reap benefits in the long run, because we're going to have all this evidence within the job market. And what it's going to demonstrate to us in the long run is that we have many artificial barriers to employment. Whether those barriers to employment are where I live versus where my job is at, or what zip code I come from, or what background I have. As Bill aptly said, we are undereducated, but we also, as Caitlin said, we need the right credentials too. Believe me, credentialing is a big issue when it comes to not only those with criminal backgrounds, but many other inclusive hiring initiatives too. So the long story short of it is, even though we may have retracted in the job market, out of necessity, employers are looking for people who are willing to work and work well. And when we invest in individuals, whether they have criminal backgrounds or regardless of what inclusive group they may come from, we will reap the benefits of that in the longer run. So we're going to take a look at all this, and we're going to use it more as evidence to indicate artificial barriers are a thing of the past, and we need to move beyond them. And again, it's not just about compliance, it's about creating a culture of inclusivity that hires the best person for the job.
I really appreciate all of these comments, and I think it's important to say two things. One is that often when we have these kinds of reform discussions, folks bring up sort of resource challenges and barriers to reform. One is that many of these policies that are part of state law can be reformed and can be improved without any cost. But two, I think, Caitlin, you alluded to this, as a result of the American Recovery Act, states are actually looking at billions of dollars, every state, while there's no specific earmark for juvenile or criminal justice, there's a lot of funding that could be used for that purpose. And so this is actually an ideal moment in time for state leaders, for employers, for the university and post-secondary community, community-based programs, to really be advocating for how these resources can be used to develop a more comprehensive focus on economic mobility, a focus on equity, for juvenile and criminal records. So rather than a lack of resources, there's really an abundance of resources, and really a great moment in time for jurisdictions to be advancing reform. So with that, I really want to thank Caitlin, Bill, and Andrew for today's conversation. To all of you who tuned in to this live broadcast, we ask everyone to please take a minute and complete a survey. You can click on the button under the broadcast or the link now showing up in the chat. We value your feedback, and it helps us improve these events. If you pre-registered for today's event, we'll send you an email with a recording of the discussion. If you didn't pre-register, you can access it on our website. And finally, we encourage you to join our email list to learn about future events, and you can sign up for that distribution list on our website. So with that, again, I want to thank Caitlin, Bill, and Andrew, and thank all of you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure being with you. Have a safe and pleasant week.